Muammar Gaddafi took power in Libya after a coup in 1969 ousted its monarch, King Idris. Shortly after, they nationalized foreign companies and shut down foreign military bases. Libya had a very small population, but Gaddafi would use its oil wealth to reach beyond its natural limitations and become a sponsor of terrorist activity around the world. State-sponsored terrorism is mainly the instrument of dictators with ambitions far in excess of their power base. Libya is an extreme example, but for its investment in terrorism, it would be not much more important than Mauritania or the Yemens. Gaddafi is still only a minor troublemaker, isolated among the Arabs, distrusted and kept at a distance even by those who support him at the United Nations or take his money. Over the course of the 1970s and 80s, Gaddafi would build a global network of anti-American, anti-Western, and anti-Zionist militants, which one journalist dubbed an empire of terror. Gaddafi was involved directly or indirectly in terrorist activity, violent conflict, or political agitation on every continent except Antarctica. I, however, am still suspicious of the Antarctic Liberation Front. Goddamn penguins. Let's start this tour on his home continent of Africa. As decolonization swept across Africa after the Second World War, plenty of opportunities for leftist and Islamist agitation made themselves available, and Colonel Gaddafi was into both of those things. Elections in South Africa in 1948 led to the National Party taking power, who began implementing the apartheid system that the international community would come to condemn. But at this time, South Africa didn't just control South Africa. Since World War I, they had been occupying Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, a former German colony that was made into a League of Nations mandate, which South Africa was given authority over. And until 1990, they basically treated it as though it were part of South Africa. This became a serious issue after the 1948 election, because South Africa would enforce its apartheid laws inside of Southwest Africa as well, which had an even smaller white population than South Africa had. Native resistance would eventually coalesce as the Southwest Africa People's Organization, or SWAPO, in 1960. Their goal was independence for Southwest Africa, which would, in turn, end the apartheid policies forced on them by South Africa. Members of SWAPO would receive training in guerrilla warfare in Libya, along with receiving funds and arms, which is how most of Gaddafi's terror network would operate. Related to SWAPO's efforts would be Mkhonto Wesizwe, the militant arm of the African National Congress, founded by Nelson Mandela in 1961 after the Sharperville massacre. Its goal was to end white minority rule and apartheid in South Africa by placing military pressure on the regime, while the ANC placed political pressure. Although Mandela claimed that their only targets would be hard targets, they eventually resorted to torture, kidnapping, summary executions, and other tactics indistinguishable from those of normal terrorists. Many members would receive training in Libya along with funds and arms being provided. They were also active in neighboring Southwest Africa and Rhodesia, where their fighters gained combat experience. Gaddafi would also intervene in military conflicts in neighboring countries. In Chad's civil war, the Gaddafi regime provided arms and funds to Frelonat. Its involvement in Chad got so deep that uniformed Libyan troops would intervene in the conflict, and at one point a political union between Chad and Libya was agreed to by the Frelonat government and Gaddafi, though no other country recognized it, and the Libyans eventually had to retreat from Chad in the late 1980s. Libya was also accused of fomenting ethnic and Islamist tensions in both Niger and Nigeria. These accusations eventually led Senegal, Gambia, and Ghana to all break off relations with Gaddafi. Libya's support for terrorism and interventions into civil wars didn't end in the 1980s, as Gaddafi was a vocal supporter of Charles Taylor and the National Patriotic Front in the Liberian Civil War, providing funds, training, and arms. He would also be supportive of the Revolutionary United Front in neighboring Sierra Leone, which was created in emulation of the National Patriotic Front and worked closely with Charles Taylor. From Africa, we go east to the Pacific, where he would continue arming Islamist and communist groups in the region. He would be most active in the Philippines, at first supporting the New People's Army. It was established after a factional split within the Philippine Communist Party in 1969, with its leaders endorsing a Maoist ideology, wanting to overthrow the pro-Western government of the Philippines. They would receive material and logistical support from the Libyans, and would themselves provide training and technical support to the Naxalites in India. On top of arming communists, Gaddafi would also arm the Islamist insurgents of the Moro people. They first supported the Moro National Liberation Front and initially were quite successful. They put enough pressure on the Philippine government that Gaddafi was able to mediate a peace agreement between the MNLF and the government in exchange for regional autonomy. However, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos decided to hold referendums in all of the regions that the autonomy agreement was supposed to affect, on whether they wanted to be part of this Muslim autonomous zone. The problem for the MNLF was that Muslims were not a majority in any of the regions that the agreement was supposed to cover, and thus they all voted against the agreement, which resulted in the MNLF deciding to continue the fight again in 1977. Not everyone in the MNLF was supportive of the agreement with the government, even before the referendums rendered them moot. Those that disapproved of the agreement would break off from the MNLF and form the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And yes, I know that acronym spells MILF. And you guys should know that this video is sponsored by Factor. Factor is a ready-made meal service that delivers delicious, never-frozen meals straight to your doorstep. Their meals are designed by dietitians to ensure that every package is filled with premium ingredients and optimal nutrition. My personal health has become a lot more important to me in the last year, and I can testify that the most important thing you can do to live a happier, healthier life is to get control of your diet. And Factor is a service that can help you do that. It's never been easier to eat healthy. No more meal prep, no more dishes, and say goodbye to fast food. Their meal options are updated weekly, so you never have to get bored with the same meal over and over again. Viewers of this channel can get a special offer by using my link in the description or going to go.factor75.com/casualhistorian. You can get 50% off your first box when you use the coupon code FACTORSE36395. Again, check out the link in the description and use my coupon code to get 50% off. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring this video, but for now, back to the history. Despite it breaking off from the MNLF, Gaddafi would continue supporting both groups. The MNLF would eventually put down their arms in 1989 after a new peace agreement was made with the government, granting a more limited autonomy for the Moro people in the Philippines. The Islamic Liberation Front would not agree to a peace agreement with the government until 2018. Moving south from the Philippines was Fretilin, or the Revolutionary Front for an Independent East Timor. They were founded in 1974 as Portugal's colonial empire in Africa began to collapse, and was hoping to ride this wave toward independence. But in 1975, Indonesia occupied the island. Gaddafi would provide aid to Fretilin through the World Mathaba organization he founded in 1982. From here, let's head to the North Pacific, all the way up to Japan and the Japanese Red Army. It was founded in 1969 as the militant wing of the Red Army faction of Japan, and would be most active during the 70s and 80s. Their most famous act of terrorism was their involvement in the Lod Airport Massacre of 1972, where they teamed up with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was also funded and armed and trained by the Libyans. Like many terrorists of the era, they conducted a lot of hijacking, such as Japanese Airlines Flight 404 in 1973. This was another collaboration with the PFLP, where they hijacked a plane over the Netherlands in hopes of ransoming the passengers in exchange for the release of Kozo Okamoto, a member of the JRA captured by the Israelis during the Lod massacre a year prior. The Israeli government refused to negotiate with them, so they eventually landed in Libya, where the passengers were released and the plane was blown up. They attempted a similar operation in 1975 in Kuala Lumpur, where they took 50 hostages in the American Insurance Associates building, which housed several embassies, which resulted in both a Swedish and an American diplomat being amongst the hostages. They demanded that the Japanese government release 5 JRA members they held in prison, which the Japanese government would agree to. After they were released from Japanese custody, they would be flown to Libya. Gaddafi would go on to hire the JRA for a wave of attacks against American and Western targets throughout the 1980s, such as attacks against the US, Canadian, and Japanese embassies in Jakarta in 1986. Later that year, they worked with the New People's Army in the Philippines to kidnap a Japanese businessman, Nobuyuki Wakoji of Mitsui & Co. in Manila. One member, Yu Kikamura, would be arrested in New Jersey for planning to bomb a naval recruitment office in 1987. And in 1988, they detonated a car bomb outside a USO facility in Naples, which killed 4 Italian civilians and a US servicewoman. And since we are already in Europe, let's move on to his network of European terrorists, often dubbed the Terrorists Internationale. Gaddafi supported the Red Brigades in Italy. They were responsible for a number of bank robberies, abductions, and assassinations. Terrorism was a serious problem in the 1970s, and in 1977 there were over 2,000 recorded acts of terrorism in Italy alone. One such abduction was that of Italy's Prime Minister Aldo Moro in 1978, which ended in the Prime Minister's death. Just as Gaddafi had supported ethnic separatism in the Pacific, he would do the same in Europe. In 1976, Libya and Algeria made a secret agreement to aid and fund several separatist movements. The biggest of these was the ETA, which is an acronym for this name, which I'm not even gonna attempt to pronounce. It's a Basque separatist movement which is present in northeastern Spain and southern France. The ETA espouses a far-left ideology and received training, funding, and arms from Libya. They also aided the National Liberation Front of Corsica, which seeks independence from France. They also attempted to aid Breton separatists in the Brittany region of France, but the movement failed to take off. One of the most famous terrorist groups that worked with the Libyans were the Irish Republican Army, or IRA. Now, this can get a bit confusing because there were a bunch of different groups at that time that called themselves the IRA and did so contemporaneously, which can make sorting it out a tad difficult because of the nature of, clandestine organizations overlapping in memberships and whatnot. So whenever I refer to the IRA in this video, just know I'm referring to the militantly active ones, and that kind of is for the best because Gaddafi wasn't picky. I mean, if you were a militant group that was fighting against the US, Britain, or Israel, Gaddafi would throw money and munitions at you. Gaddafi began supporting the IRA in 1972 during a trip by Joe Cahill to Tripoli, arranging arms shipments and financial aid. The IRA had been getting arms from the US, but the CIA had been cutting off these weapon shipments, which meant the IRA needed a new supplier. The first shipment of arms from Libya came in March of 1973. The ship was spotted, probably by a submarine, and the Irish government was alerted. And when it reached Irish waters, the Irish Naval Service would intercept it. Joe Cahill was aboard, and he was sentenced to jail for 3 years. The IRA blamed Gaddafi for the mission's failure, while Gaddafi blamed the IRA. Between August 1985 and September 1986, at least 4 sizable shipments of arms from Libya reached Ireland without detection, delivering between 115 and 130 tons of arms, including AK-47s, Brazilian handguns, Bulgarian RPGs, Dushkas, surface-to-air missiles, and explosives. Gary Adams tried to convert the IRA's efforts into a political fight, but the abundance of weapons made armed struggle more appealing. The surface-to-air missiles were sent to help shoot down British helicopters, but they were too complicated for the IRA members to operate. The last ship to be detected and intercepted was caught in October 1987 by the French off the coast of Brest, carrying 150 tons of weapons, including surface-to-air missiles and mortars. And Gaddafi would take credit for IRA bombings. The bombs which are convulsing Britain and breaking its spirit are the bombs of the Libyan people. We have sent them to the Irish revolutionaries so that the British will pay the price for their past deeds. Gaddafi also worked with the Red Army faction in West Germany. Like all the others, they received training, funds, and arms from Libya, and in December of 1975, they were involved in the taking of 11 government ministers hostage from an OPEC meeting in Vienna. The operation was led by one of the most famous terrorists of the era, Ramirez Sanchez, better known by the alias Carlos the Jackal. After a 2-day siege, flights were arranged to Algiers and Tripoli, which allowed both the terrorists and hostages to escape with their lives. This was one of the first times terrorists had targeted Arab leaders, which led to Arab governments beginning to cooperate with American and European efforts to combat international terrorism. While we're on the subject, let's look at the Middle East. Muammar Gaddafi was a raging anti-Semite, and became dedicated to the Palestinian cause above most others, and the various Palestinian terrorist groups gladly accepted his help. The biggest name in Palestinian terrorism was the Palestine Liberation Organization, who would receive training, funds, and arms from Gaddafi and Libya. Under Gaddafi, the Libyan government collected a special tax from Palestinians living in Libya that would be redirected to the Palestine National Fund, which was basically a money laundering operation sending money to terrorists. His support would become direct during the Lebanese Civil War, when he sent the PLO surface-to-air missiles and anti-tank weapons prior to Israel's invasion in 1982. He would even send Libyan volunteers to fight alongside the PLO. Alongside the PLO, Gaddafi aided Black September, a Palestinian terrorist group that brought the Kingdom of Jordan to the precipice of civil war in 1970. Members of Black September trained in Libya before launching their attack on Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. After the massacre, Gaddafi awarded Yasser Arafat and Black September $5 million and got the bodies of the terrorists brought back to Libya. He would also help orchestrate the release of the surviving members of the attack by sponsoring the hijacking of a Lufthansa plane. The West German government agreed to hand over the terrorists in exchange for the hostages, with the terrorists being released into Libyan custody. Next, we're going to the Western Hemisphere, in particular Latin America, where the Cold War was ramping up in the 1970s. Throughout Latin America, the Libyans would be involved alongside Cuba, who became their conduit for providing arms and funding to the various revolutionary groups. Both would provide aid to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, as well as the various militias that would go on to form the National Revolutionary Unity Party in Guatemala, along with the Farabundo Marti Nacional Liberación Front in El Salvador. And down in South America, they aided the Tupamaros in Uruguay, the Manuel Rodriguez Patriotic Front in Chile, and the 19th of April movement in Colombia. They were also involved in the United States, though they never got any domestic group to commit acts of terrorism. Gaddafi was a supporter of the remnants of the Black Panther Party in the 1970s, providing them financial support. Stokely Carmichael, the honorary prime minister of the party, distanced himself from the organization in the early 70s, when he became a supporter of Pan-Africanism. He came to believe that black liberation in America was only possible if a united socialist Africa was created, which led him to become a fan of Muammar Gaddafi, who touted Pan-Africanist rhetoric. But more so than the Black Panthers, Gaddafi would become financially invested in the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad would meet with Gaddafi for the first time in 1972, who would give them $3 million to purchase some real estate on the south side of Chicago. This relationship continued after Louis Farrakhan took over, visiting Gaddafi himself in 1985. And after this visit, Gaddafi gave them another $5 million in order to fund various nation programs. Farrakhan visited Gaddafi again in 1996, after which Gaddafi tried to give them another $1 billion, to which the Nation of Islam had to apply for an exemption from the State Department because Libya's assets in the US were frozen and it was still labeled as a state sponsor of terrorism. The exemption was denied. Libya was also involved in numerous other terrorist acts directly, such as the discotheque bombings in Berlin that led to Operation El Dorado Canyon in 1986, or those over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988, or the UDTA 772 flight over Niger in 1989. There's also this weird story where Billy Carter, the brother of President Jimmy Carter, was exposed to have been a paid agent of Muammar Gaddafi in 1980, but those are stories I'm saving for another time. Now, needless to say, this video only scratches the surface when talking about Gaddafi's involvement in terrorism or in other country civil wars. And so if you're interested in seeing more about that kind of stuff when I eventually getting to make videos about it, then I suggest you click that subscribe button so you don't miss those videos when they come out. And additionally, the channel is getting really close to 100,000 subscribers. I suspect we'll probably hitting that number sometime in the next couple months. So if you want to help me get to 100,000 before the end of summer this year, then click that subscribe button. We'll get there together and we'll celebrate at some point. I'd also like to thank Factor again for sponsoring this video. Go ahead and check out the link in the description and use my coupon code to get 50% off your first order. And of course, I would like to thank my patrons for making this video possible. Their support allows me to spend more time making videos and less time working a regular day job. So thank you to my patrons for making this video possible. If you'd like to learn more about the fall of Gaddafi's regime, then I suggest you check out my previous video about the Arab Spring, which unfortunately has been age restricted, but you know, additional views never hurt. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.